In this month's Economic Update, Kaplan Professional Education's Trevor Treharne speaks to an industry economist about the short-term domestic and global economic outlook.
Welcome to Kaplan Professional Education's monthly Economic Update. I'm Trevor Treharne, and this month we're speaking with the Australian School of Business's Fellow of Economics, Tim Harcourt. Thanks for joining us today, Tim.
Great to be here. Thanks, Trevor.
Based on election promises and early indications, what do you think will be the economic impact of Australia's new government?
I don't think there will be much change in economic policy. I think the coalition in opposition talked about the budget emergency, about the terrible debt that Australia had, when it knew, quite well that Australia was in a very, very good position in terms of debt, in terms of its budget. And in fact, the Labor Party did a very good job in steering Australia through the global financial crisis and the aftermath. So I think for the most part, the coalition won't change much. And all of a sudden, with the new government, all these emergencies are suddenly gone. So I think for the most part they'll keep macroeconomic policy the same. They may change things on the mining tax and the carbon tax and maybe in industrial relations, but for the most part the macroeconomic settings will be exactly the same. And one of the big things about Australia in the last 10 years or so is that Australia's been very good at macroeconomic management, and one of the troubles the Labor Party had politically is that it had done very, very well in terms of economics, but it didn't sell its success as well as it could, and the coalition took advantage of that. But I expect fundamentally they won't make any changes compared to the previous Labor government.
We're being told that Australia must diversify its economic focus away from natural resources. Which areas of the economy should we focus on?
It's interesting, this question about Australia doing too much in rocks and crops, in mining and agriculture, has been around for a long time. 10 years ago or so, at the time of the Sydney Olympics, the head of the Hewlett-Packard, Carly Fiorina, said we should close down all our mines and farms and we should become the new Taiwan, selling software overseas. If we don't do that, the dollar will be 30 cents by 2013. Well, guess what? As soon as she said that, all the terrible things we're in, all the old economy things like mining and farming, prices went to record levels, and all the things she told us to get into, software, prices dived. And our terms of trade's been at record highs. And of course the dollar's not 30 cents. So I think for the most part, the things that we do well in mining and agriculture should continue. But things that we do in terms of services and technology behind those sectors, we can also excel in as well. I've just come back from China, where in Chengdu, in Western China, the Australian architectural firms and construction firms are doing very well. When I go to Siberia and Russia, the companies selling technology to the mining sector are doing extraordinarily well. And when I'm in Argentina or the Middle East, people that sell services and technology to the agricultural sector do very well. So I don't think it's a matter of diversifying, I think it's a matter of deepening these very strong service industries we have behind our natural advantages.
We've been seeing indications that Chinese economic growth is slowing. How will that impact the Australian economy?
Most people thought that the bottom would fall out of the Chinese economy for some time now. And during the global financial crisis, the stimulus package did help China, particularly in Western China, and that helped Australia. I think structurally the world has changed whereby China had too many shippers and not enough shoppers. It wanted to wean it off its dependence on export-led development and go towards domestic consumption and investment, while America had too many shoppers and not enough shippers. I think what we're seeing now is China is moving that way structurally. They're doing that even before Lehman Brothers, and that means to some extent they won't grow at 10, 11%. They'll be growing at 7, 7.5%. That means that there'll still be demand for Australian rocks and crops, but increasingly as China moves west, as they want to build more airports, more civic buildings, more schools, more shopping malls, the architecture firms, the professional services firms from Australia will get a bigger slice of the action. So I think China will slow. That will take some points off the growth in our commodity sector, but we'll pick it up in services.
China's performance has contributed to the World Bank lowering its growth forecast for Eastern Asia. What are the overarching factors behind the region's slowing growth?
Well, I think there's a couple of reasons. One is the structural change in the Chinese economy, going from a nation of shippers to a nation of shoppers, moving away from the export-led development model to more domestic consumption and investment. Also, I think the stimulus package that they put together during the GFC to go west and build up Chengdu and Chongqing and Wuhan, these second and third tier cities, these mere country towns of 15 million people or so. I think that's one reason for the change in growth composition and the slowing. And lastly, I think to some extent they do have labour shortages in China. They want to take the steam out of wage and price inflation. 10 years ago when I went to China and I went to a factory and they said, do you have workers' compensation in China? They said, well, if the workers break anything, they don't have to compensate us. Now when I go to those factories and I ask the same question, they say, well, actually, we have to pay workers higher wages because we'll lose them to the white-collar sector. So I think the Chinese labour market's certainly changing.
What do we learn from the Apec summit in terms of the economic outlook for the region?
Well, I think the recent Apec summit showed how reliant the world is on East Asian growth in particular. I mean, Apec is particularly the Asia Pacific, the East Asia, plus the US and Latin America and Russia. And Russia was only in there because Bill Clinton wanted to look after Boris Yeltsin. And I think what Apec showed is that as the US sort of reduces its Asian pivot, we rely more and more on the growth engines of China and Korea and Japan and Southeast Asia and Australia and Latin America. I think what was quite noticeable was that as Obama didn't go, the Chinese now are reaching out to various regions in terms of economic leadership. Japan is too to some extent, but I think Abenomics is mainly concentrated on domestic Japanese consumption. So for the most part, I think the big lesson of APEC is that East Asia will be the locus of growth for the world economy, and increasingly China will be taking an international leadership position, particularly as the US creates somewhat of a vacuum.
Japan will be raising its consumption tax from 5% to 8% in April next year. What will be the result of this shift?
Well, Japan's interesting because, I mean, Japan had these decades of almost no growth. An ageing population, it has no immigration, so it's running out of husbands. What it's finding is that it's got a wealthy population but with not much growth. And basically consumption being concentrated in the older classes. So I think what it wants to do is to improve its fiscal position through the consumption tax, but also ensure that there's more consumption from younger middle-class members of Japanese society, particularly middle-class, young to middle-aged women that are now becoming more powerful economically and politically in Japan. I think for a nation like Australia, our services composition of exports from Japan will change. Tourism for many years was salary men coming to Australia for 3 days and doing golf and karaoke and getting back on the bus. Now Japanese women are taking control of those tourism and education decisions, and we're seeing more long-term Japanese tourism here in Australia. And that's got quite good benefits to Australia, but it's going to be fundamentally different than what we've seen in the past.
The Eurozone's labour market appears to have stabilised, with suggestions that unemployment has peaked at 12%. How will that assist other areas of the Eurozone economy?
The labour market in Europe, a lot of people regard it as being due to a dog's breakfast of labour market regulations. In many cases, it's often based on on competition policy on the company side, and a lot of it's to do with demographics and the fact that the Eurozone tried to tie everyone together. At the end of the day, you can't expect a German factory worker who's 67 to pay for a 51-year-old Greek pensioner's public service pension. So I think the tensions come basically in that imbalance. I think we've probably seen the worst of the labour market woes of Europe. We can note that in Germany, unemployment is now lower than it was when East and West Germany were separate labour markets. So I think there is some strength in that part of Europe, but probably in Greece and Italy and Spain, a long way to go. And to some extent, I think some of the rescheduling of the European institutions is the way to deal with a lot of that labour market issue.
Just as the Eurozone economy looked to be moving in the right direction, there has been some fractions in Italy. Can you talk us through what has happened in Italy recently? The
Italian political system basically conjures up all sorts of solutions, particularly with coalition governments, particularly with not a clear delineation between the state and the judiciary, and also issues regionally, where you've got a very rich north still with some separatist movements of the Northern League, and then a poorer south, where the transfer within Italy is not always as smooth as you'd like it to be. I think now you've seen a real fragmentation of the right around Berlusconi. I think some of his extracurricular activities are coming home to burn him a bit, and a lot of his former allies on the right have had enough. The left has been splintered as well, and for the most part, Italian pragmatism, which has worked well in a lot of its private enterprise, is now coming through in its politics. It's going to be a very long way to go. It's very difficult, I think, for the average Italian who's locked out of political circles and business circles. A lot of them are choosing to migrate again, particularly here to Australia. But some of the recent moves have probably been better than they would have been about 12 months ago.
Angela Merkel has been re-elected as Chancellor of Germany. How will that impact the German economy?
Well, to some extent, Angela Merkel's re-election means that the problems that she created, to some extent, in terms of European leadership, she'll have to fix. So, in some ways, it's a good thing because she'll be quite across my big fat Greek debt and all those other issues that she's had to handle. On the other hand, I think to some extent, Germany does have to pull back from dictating to other members of the Eurozone and other of the southern European countries. And just because Germany has got its own house in order, to some extent it's been able to export its problems elsewhere. And that will probably come home to roost. So ultimately the person who has created some of the architectural issues will have to take responsibility, and I think that'll be her next challenge.
Labour productivity growth in the United States has lost momentum over the last year. What is causing that?
Look, I think the issue with the American labour market is that for many years they had a very low unemployment rate relative to Australia and to Europe for that matter. The US always said we have a low minimum wage, but we have great labour market mobility. You can start on the bottom rung of the labour market but move up pretty quickly, and our unemployment rate is low. Now we've got a situation in America where the minimum wage is still low by international standards, unemployment is high, and America now doesn't have that labour market mobility that it once had. 90% of American workers haven't had a real wage increase in 20 years. They've got real issues in their labour market. I think the appointment of Janet Yellen to the Federal Reserve Board will be a good thing, because one of Yellen's great contributions to economics was the efficiency wage theorem that she wrote with George Akerlof, who happens to be her husband, on efficiency wages. It says if you increase wages above the minimum wage, you'll ultimately improve workers' productivity and efficiency, so it'll pay off for the firm. I think some of that analysis that Yellen did could come into policy quite effectively now in the US, particularly with minimum wages sitting so low and unemployment being so high.
What were the main economic factors that contributed to the US government shutting down?
Well, I think they're as much political as economic. I think politically we have a civil war in the Republican Party. We have the traditional Republicans, the moderates, we have the Tea Party and the Democrats. So it's almost like three parties running US Congress with the President. Ultimately, I think the issues that you've seen in the US with the debt ceiling, with the fiscal cliff, have been a result of internal divisions in the Republican Party. As we bump along this, legislative gridlock continually, as we've done over the past 18 months, I think two things will happen. One is, as with Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich, if the Republicans get blamed for the shutdown, their polling numbers will go south. That will force the moderate Republicans to have some bargaining power over the Tea Party. That could actually help things. Secondly, the Wall Street donors of the Republican Party have been very generous for many years. They'll turn the tap off. And in America, you can't be politically successful without votes. You can't be successful without money. You won't get any votes. So I think if there's pressure put by the corporate sector in America to the Republican Party, particularly the Tea Party, that will to some extent repair some of the damage that we've seen.
President Barack Obama has nominated Janet Yellen to be the chair of the Federal Reserve. What will Yellen's main challenges be in that role?
Very good nomination, Janet Yellen. She's the best person, female or male, for the job. She's the best qualified. She's had a distinguished record in academia, working on macroeconomics, monetary policy and the labour market. She's been a very, very seasoned campaigner at the Fed, concerned about unemployment, concerned about excessive inflation. She stood up to Greenspan on the housing bubble. She stood up to Bernanke as well. I think she's an excellent appointment. I think her main challenge will be basically getting through the post-quantitative easing period, ensuring that there's no inflationary pressures, ensuring that America returns to a more healthy labour market. And I think her background in efficiency wages and improving wages and productivity will make her very well placed. I think she'll provide good moral leadership, and particularly in Asia, given her background at the University of California, Berkeley, particularly her interest here in Australia, means she'll be far more focused on the Asia Pacific than the more transatlantic predecessors that have been in the Federal Reserve Bank Chairman's position.
Thanks for joining us today, Tim.
Pleasure. Thank you very much.